Picture this. 300 guests on a decorated fishing dock in Gloucester, Massachusetts. The smell of salt and roses mixing in the evening air. My son is the happiest I have ever seen him. Then his bride takes the microphone and tells every person there that I am giving them my family's harbor. The boats. The warehouse. The legacy my immigrant grandfather carried across an ocean on his back. I never agreed to a single word of it. When I stood up and refused, she did not slap me. She did something worse. She looked at the crowd with soft concern and said, "Do not worry." His doctor warned us about these episodes. 300 people looked at me like I was losing my mind. One phone call that night set something in motion that she and the people behind her never saw coming. And it started with a secret my dead wife left inside a boat nobody had touched in 5 years. My name is Frank Moretti. I am 70 years old. I have spent my entire life on the working waterfront of Gloucester, a town that smells like diesel fuel and brine, and the kind of honesty that comes from pulling your living out of the sea with your own hands. My grandfather Giuseppe built this harbor from nothing. My father expanded it. I have run it for 42 years, and in that time, I have buried both my parents, weathered 3 recessions, and lost the only woman I ever loved to a stroke that came without warning on a Tuesday morning while she was balancing the quarterly ledger at her desk. Donna had been gone 12 months when Tony got married. 12 months of waking up in a house that still smelled like her lavender hand cream. 12 months of sitting at a kitchen table, built by my grandfather's hands, with one empty chair across from me that I could not bring myself to move. I had hoped the wedding would mark something new, something bright enough to cut through the gray that had settled over everything since she left. The dock looked beautiful that evening. They had strung lanterns between the mooring posts, hundreds of them. Warm golden light swaying in the harbor breeze. White roses lined the railings, and a jazz trio played softly near the gangway while the late summer sun turned the water to copper. I stood near the edge of the celebration, with a glass of sparkling cider in my hand. I do not drink alcohol. Have not since my father told me at 19 that a man who runs boats and runs liquor at the same time will eventually lose both. I watched Tony beam beside his new bride and raised my glass quietly toward the empty chair I had asked the staff to place beside me. A place for Donna. I let myself believe, just for that moment, that she was still close enough to see him. Kristen was beautiful. I will not pretend otherwise. Her gown caught the lantern light like something carved from pearl, and I had watched her work the room all afternoon. Every handshake came paired with a glance that assessed. Every compliment landed with the precision of someone performing rather than feeling. I had noticed this quality in her for months, but I told myself I was being unfair. A man who has buried his wife learns quickly that grief distorts perception, and I did not want to borrow trouble from a place that was supposed to hold joy. Tony spoke first when the toasts began. His words were honest and unhurried. He thanked every person on that dock, mentioned his mother without his voice breaking, and raised his glass with a hand that did not tremble. I was proud of him in a way that settled deep into my bones. I am still proud of him. Even now, knowing everything that came after. Then Kristen stood up. She took the microphone with the ease of someone who had been waiting for precisely this moment. The dock quieted the way crowds quiet when someone beautiful commands attention. I noticed how she let the silence build before she spoke. Her eyes swept the guests slowly, taking in the neighbors, the old fishing families, the handful of people I recognized from the local paper. Then she turned toward me, and something in my chest went still. She began talking about family and tradition and legacy. Her voice was bright and warm as a fire you have not yet decided to trust. She spoke about the Moretti name, as though it belonged to her already. And then, before I fully understood what was happening, she announced to every soul on that dock that I would be handing over the keys to Moretti Harbor. All of it. The boats, the processing house, the warehouse, the brand my wife had built, right here. Tonight. The applause came before I could draw breath. Glasses clinked. Cameras flashed. People turned to look at me with that warm, expectant glow that crowds get when they believe they are witnessing something generous. I set my glass down. I stood up slowly, and into a dock that had gone suddenly, completely quiet. I said the only words I had. Over my dead body. The silence that followed was 300 people recalculating what they thought they were watching. I could feel every pair of eyes land on me at once, heavy as rope. Kristen did not flinch. She tilted her head slightly. The way a person tilts their head when they are about to say something rehearsed. And she looked out at the crowd with an expression of gentle, practiced concern. In a voice just loud enough to carry across the water, she said, "Please do not be alarmed. His doctor warned us these episodes might happen. We are keeping a close eye on him." 300 people looked at me the way you look at someone who has stopped making sense. Not with anger, with pity. And pity, I can tell you from that dock on that evening, is worse than any slap. A slap leaves a mark that proves someone hit you. Pity just leaves you standing alone in a crowd that has already decided you are not quite all there. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at my son, though I could feel him somewhere to my left, frozen between the two people he loved most in the world. I turned, walked through the crowd that parted without a word, and stepped off the dock into the cool night air. The harbor was quiet beyond the celebration. I walked past the processing house, past the bait shed my grandfather built the year he arrived, past the lobster traps stacked against the fence. The music behind me started again, thin and uncertain, and someone called my name. I kept walking. There are moments in a man's life when dignity is the only thing he has left, and the only way to hold on to it is to not stop moving. I walked until I reached the far end of the harbor, where the older boats are tied. And there, rocking gently in the dark on frayed lines and a mooring post thick with barnacles, was the Santa Lucia, my grandfather's first boat, the one he bought with 5 years of savings. The one my wife had stood on the morning of our wedding, laughing into the wind with her veil streaming behind her like a sail. Nobody had touched it in 5 years. I stood there looking at it, the tide pulling quietly at the pilings, and I reached into my jacket and took out my phone. I did not make the call right away. I stood at the end of the dock with the phone in my hand and the dark harbor stretching out before me, and I let the night settle into the places that the noise of the reception had not been able to reach. The tide was going out. I could hear it in the way the water pulled at the pilings beneath my feet. That slow, patient draw that has marked time on this waterfront, longer than any clock or calendar. The boats shifted in their slips with the low, familiar creak of wood and rope, and the smell of brine and diesel hung in the air the way it always has, the way it will long after I am gone. I lowered myself onto the edge of the dock, my legs hanging over the water the way they used to when I was a boy, when my grandfather Giuseppe would sit beside me on this same stretch of planking and tell me stories about Sicily in a voice that still carried the shape of the island, even after 40 years of American English. He came to Gloucester in 1951 with a cardboard suitcase, $11, and a belief that the Atlantic Ocean owed him a living if he was willing to work hard enough to collect it. He was not a man who waited for permission. He found a dock that nobody wanted, a stretch of rotting timber at the far end of the harbor that the city had written off as a liability, and he rebuilt it with lumber he salvaged from a decommissioned trawler and nails he bought on credit from a hardware store whose owner did not expect to see the money again. He saw the money again, every cent, ahead of schedule, delivered in person with a handshake that my grandfather considered the only contract worth signing. By the time I was born, Moretti Harbor had 12 working slips, a bait house, a fuel depot, and a reputation among the fishing families of Cape Ann as the one place on the waterfront where your boat would be looked after as if it belonged to the man running the dock. My father expanded it through the 60s and 70s, added the processing house, built the cold storage facility that still stands at the east end of the property. He was quieter than Giuseppe, more careful with numbers, less inclined toward grand gestures, but he understood something my grandfather had known instinctively, that a harbor is not a business. It is a community held together by timber and trust, and if you take care of both, neither one will let you down. I took over in 1982. I was 28 years old, newly married, carrying a logbook full of debts my father had left behind along with the dock, and a stubbornness about paying them off that I inherited from both sides of my family. What I had that made the difference was Donna. She was not from a fishing family. She grew up in Worcester, studied accounting at a community college, and came to Gloucester for a summer job at a restaurant on the waterfront. I met her at a clam bake on the 4th of July. She was 24 years old, laughing at something someone had said, and the way the firelight caught her face stopped me mid-sentence, in a conversation I have never been able to remember the other half of. We were married 11 months later on the deck of the Santa Lucia with Sal Benedetto as best man, and the whole harbor watching from the dock. Donna did not just marry me. She married the harbor. She took over the books within the first year, straightened out the accounts my father had tangled, built a filing system so precise that she could tell you the fuel consumption of any boat in any slip for any month going back a decade. She named the processing operation Moretti's Catch. That was her idea. Her handwriting on the original sign, her voice on the phone building relationships with distributors from Boston to Portland until the name meant something up and down the coast. She ran the business side of the harbor the way some people run a church, with quiet devotion and absolute precision, but what she understood better than the numbers, better than the logistics, better than the branding she had built from scratch, was what this place meant to the people who depended on it. 23 families. That is how many fishing households operated out of Moretti Harbor. 23 families whose mortgages and groceries and children's school supplies depended on the slips and the fuel and the processing capacity and the fair prices that this dock had provided since my grandfather rebuilt it with salvaged wood and borrowed nails. Donna knew every one of those families by name. She knew their boats, their catch histories, their children's birthdays. She kept a list on the wall behind her desk that she updated every January, and when I asked her once why she bothered, she looked at me with that expression she reserved for questions she found slightly ridiculous, and said, because if we ever forget who we are working for, Frankie, then we have already lost the only thing worth keeping. Frankie. Nobody else in the world called me that. Not my parents, not my son, not a single soul on this dock, or any other. Only Donna. And sitting on the edge of the harbor with the water black beneath my feet, and the sound of the reception still drifting from behind me like a song being played in another room, I could hear her voice saying it as clearly as if she were beside me. I looked down at my hands. They rested in my lap the way hands rest when they have nowhere else to go. Calloused, scarred across the knuckles from decades of rope work and engine repair and hauling traps in weather that should have kept us on shore. Donna used to take my hands in both of hers and hold them the way you hold something you consider valuable. And she would say, "These hands feed 23 families, Frankie, and do not you ever let anyone tell you that is a small thing." I thought of that sitting there in the dark. And then I scrolled through my phone until I found the name I needed. The line rang twice. A voice answered, unhurried, as though he had been expecting the call. I said 3 words. They made their move. He said he would be at my door before sunrise. I set the phone on the dock beside me and looked out across the water toward the breakwater light, blinking its slow red rhythm against the dark, and I understood in a way I had not fully allowed myself to understand until that moment that whatever was coming next was going to require more from me than grief had left behind. But I also understood, sitting on wood my grandfather had laid with his own hands, that I was not starting from nothing. I was starting from 60 years of something that 300 confused faces on a decorated dock could not undo. The man I called was Vincent Caruso. People who knew him well called him Vinny. He had been our family's attorney for 35 years, and Donna had trusted him with things she had not trusted to me. I did not know that yet. I would learn it in the morning. Vinny Caruso arrived at my door at 4:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because the kitchen clock had become my closest companion in the 12 months since Donna passed. I would sit at the table, watch the second-hand crawl, and pretend the ticking was her footsteps somewhere in the house. That morning the ticking stopped mattering because Vinny stood on my porch with a leather briefcase older than my marriage and a face that told me he had not slept either. He sat across from me at the same table where Donna used to spread her ledgers every Sunday evening. He placed his coffee down, looked me straight in the eyes, and said something I was not prepared to hear. "Frank, Donna came to see me 14 months ago. Alone. She made me swear I would not tell you unless the day came when someone tried to take this harbor from you. I suppose that day has come." I felt my throat tighten. 14 months ago, Donna was already sick. The doctors had given her a year, maybe 13 months, if she was lucky. She had spent one of those precious months not resting, not saying goodbye, not sitting in the garden she loved. She had spent it building a wall around everything our family had ever touched. Vinny opened the briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope sealed with red wax. Donna's handwriting on the front read in neat capital letters, "For Frankie. When the tide turns." I ran my thumb across the ink. She always wrote my name the same way. A slight upward slant on the F, a tiny heart dotting the I in the nickname only she was allowed to use. I did not open it. Not yet. I needed to hear Vinny explain what she had done first. He told me that Donna had established a living trust called the Moretti Harbor Preservation Trust. The trust held every major asset connected to our name: the commercial dock and all 23 slips, the processing house and cold storage facility, the fuel depot, the bait shop, the brand name and trademark for Moretti's catch, the fishing licenses attached to our fleet of 9 vessels, and the Santa Lucia, listed separately with a special notation that read, "This vessel shall not be sold, transferred, leased, or modified without the unanimous written consent of all trustees and the Harbor Historical Board of Gloucester." I stared at Vinny. "She did all of this while she was dying." He nodded slowly. "She sat in my office 3 separate times. Each visit lasted about 2 hours. She brought every document, every deed, every registration number. She had folders organized by color. She even brought a timeline of when each asset was acquired and by whom, going all the way back to your grandfather Giuseppe's original purchase in 1951. The trust named 3 trustees. The first was me, Frank Joseph Moretti. The second was Vincent Caruso, attorney at law. The third was a woman named Ruth Chen, a retired probate judge who had served Essex County for 22 years. I had never heard the name before. Vinny explained that Donna had researched dozens of retired judges before selecting Ruth. She wanted someone with no personal connection to the family, no business ties to Gloucester fishing interests, and an impeccable record of protecting family assets from hostile claims. I asked Vinny why Donna had not told me. He paused for a long time. Then he said, "She told me you would ask that. She said to tell you this. Frankie does not fight well when he sees the punch coming. He tenses up, second guesses, talks himself out of swinging. But when someone catches him off guard, he plants his feet and does not move. She wanted you to be caught off guard by the protection, not by the threat. That way you would stand firm instead of trying to negotiate it away." I had to set my coffee down because my hands were shaking. 41 years of marriage, and that woman still knew me better than I knew myself. She knew I would have argued with her. I would have said it was unnecessary, that Tony was our son, and he would never let anyone take what his grandfather built. She knew I would have softened the provisions, removed the third trustee, maybe even left the Santa Lucia out of the documents to avoid seeming paranoid. And she was right. I would have done every single one of those things. Vinny then explained the protective covenant. Donna had attached a separate legal instrument to the trust, a covenant that imposed specific restrictions on any attempt to transfer, sell, or encumber harbor assets. No single trustee could authorize a transaction alone. Any proposed sale required a 90-day public review period, during which the 23 fishing families who leased slips at the harbor would be formally notified and given the right to object. Any transfer to a commercial developer was permanently prohibited unless all 3 trustees, the leaseholders, and the Gloucester Harbor Commission unanimously agreed. She thought of the families. I whispered. Vinny smiled for the first time that morning. She thought of everyone, Frank. Every single person who depends on this dock. She told me once that the harbor was not really yours. She said it belonged to the 23 families, and you were just the man stubborn enough to keep it running for them. I picked up the manila envelope. The red wax cracked under my thumb. Inside were 3 items. The first was a certified copy of the complete trust document, 47 pages, every one initialed by Donna in blue ink. The second was a handwritten letter, 4 pages, front and back, in Donna's careful script. The third was a small brass key taped to an index card. The card read, Santa Lucia, starboard cabinet, bottom drawer. You will know when it is time. I set the key on the table and stared at it. Somewhere across the harbor, the Santa Lucia sat in the dark, holding whatever Donna had placed inside her 5 years ago. Vinny watched me, but said nothing. The kitchen clock resumed its ticking. I folded the letter without reading it and placed it back in the envelope. Not yet. Some things need the right moment, and this was not it. Not while my hands were still shaking. Not while I could still hear Kristen's voice from the wedding echoing in my skull. His doctor warned us about these episodes. I looked at Vinny and said, What do we do first? He pulled a yellow legal pad from the briefcase and clicked his pen. First, he said, we make sure the world knows you are not crazy. The competency evaluation took place on a Tuesday, 9 days after the wedding. Dr. Alan Firth had been practicing geriatric psychiatry in Salem for 28 years. Vinny chose him specifically because he had served as an expert witness in over 40 conservatorship cases across Essex County and had a reputation for being thorough to the point of exhausting. His evaluations typically lasted 90 minutes. Mine lasted 2 hours and 15 minutes because I would not stop talking about Donna's filing system, and he found it genuinely interesting. Dr. Firth tested my memory, my reasoning, my ability to manage finances, my awareness of current events, and my emotional stability. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. He asked me to draw a clock face showing 10 minutes past 11. He asked me what year Giuseppe arrived in Gloucester, and I told him 1951 with $11 and a cardboard suitcase. He asked me to name every vessel in my fleet, and I named all 9, along with their registration numbers, hull colors, and the year each one was purchased or built. When I finished, he set his pen down and said, Mr. Moretti, you are one of the sharpest 70-year-old men I have ever evaluated. His written report used the phrase, no evidence of cognitive decline, impairment, or diminished capacity. Vinny had the report notarized and filed with Essex County Probate Court that same afternoon. But Kristen had been busy during those 9 days too. 3 days after the wedding, a video appeared online. It had been edited from footage someone recorded on a phone during the reception. The original footage would have shown the full sequence. Kristen making her announcement. Me standing up. Me saying over my dead body. Her responding calmly. Me walking away with dignity, while 300 people watched in silence. But the version that appeared online did not show any of that. It began mid-sentence with me shouting. My face red. My finger pointing. The audio had been cleaned, so that Kristen's words before mine were muffled and indistinct. But my voice came through sharp and loud. An angry old man screaming at a bride on her wedding day. That is what the world saw. The video spread faster than anything I could have imagined. Within 48 hours it had been shared thousands of times. Comment sections filled with strangers calling me senile, abusive, dangerous, unstable. Someone created a hashtag. I will not repeat it because it does not deserve to live any longer than it already has. Local news stations in Boston picked it up. A producer from a national morning show called Vinny's office, asking if the family wanted to comment. Vinny said no. Not yet. Then came the interview. Kristen sat down with a journalist from the Boston Globe, a reporter named Diane Calloway, who covered human interest stories for the Metro section. The article ran with a photograph of Kristen looking composed and sympathetic. Her hands folded on the table, her eyes soft with what I can only describe as rehearsed concern. The headline read, Bride speaks out about father-in-law's alarming decline. In the article, Kristen described a pattern of erratic behavior she claimed had been escalating for months. She said I had forgotten Tony's birthday twice. She said I had become paranoid about strangers visiting the dock. She said I once accused a delivery driver of stealing fuel, which never happened. She said the outburst at the wedding was simply the moment she and Tony could no longer hide the truth from the people who loved me. She cried during the interview. Diane Calloway noted that Kristen paused several times to collect herself and that her hands trembled when she spoke about her fear that Frank might hurt himself or someone else if he continued to manage the harbor alone. The article ended with Kristen saying, "All we want is to make sure he is safe and cared for." This was never about property. It was always about love. I read that article sitting at the kitchen table at 6:14 in the morning. I read it 3 times. The third time, I noticed something that Kristen probably thought no one would catch. She mentioned that Tony and I had not spoken in several months before the wedding. That was true. But she attributed the silence to my declining mental state, suggesting I had pushed Tony away during a confused and agitated period. What she did not say, what she carefully left out, was that the silence began exactly when she entered Tony's life. 14 months before the wedding. The same month, Donna went to see Vinny. Donna had seen it. She had watched Kristen arrive, watched Tony pull away, watched the phone calls grow shorter, and the visits grow rarer. She never told me her suspicions directly. That was not Donna's way. Donna's way was to build quietly, plan carefully, and leave the evidence where the right person would find it at the right time. She had gone to Vinny not because she knew exactly what would happen, but because she understood the shape of what was coming. She read people the way she read balance sheets. Patterns. Inconsistencies. Numbers that did not add up. The 23 families did not wait to be asked. Sal Medeiros, who had leased slip number 7 for 31 years, was the first to call. Then came Bobby Tran from slip 12. Then the Herrera brothers from slips 4 and 5. Then old Pete Kowalski, who could barely walk but drove himself to my door to say, "Frank, I have seen you every morning on that dock for 4 decades, and you have never once forgotten my name or my mooring line." Within 1 week, 17 of the 23 families had signed a joint letter addressed to the Essex County Probate Court, stating that Frank Moretti was of sound mind and excellent character, and that any suggestion otherwise was, in Pete Kowalski's words, an insult to every honest fisherman who ever tied a line at this harbor. Vinny collected the letters, attached them to Dr. Firth's evaluation, and filed a formal response to what he anticipated would be Kristen's next move. He was right. On day 11, the conservatorship petition arrived, filed by Kristen Vale Moretti, on behalf of her husband Anthony Moretti, requesting that the Essex County Probate Court appoint a legal conservator over Frank Joseph Moretti and all assets under his control, citing diminished mental capacity and risk of financial mismanagement. I held the document and felt its weight. Not the weight of paper. The weight of someone trying to erase you while you are still breathing. I set the petition on the kitchen table next to Donna's sealed letter and the brass key I still had not used. 3 objects in a row. The attack, the answer, and the mystery. I looked at Vinny and said, "How long do we have?" He said, 60 days. The clock on the wall kept ticking. Sal Medeiros showed up at my door the morning after the conservatorship petition was filed, carrying a thermos of black coffee and a rolled-up nautical chart from 1986. He spread the chart on my kitchen table, pointed to a cluster of pencil marks near the harbor entrance, and said, "You see these marks, Frank? Your father made these." He charted every rock, every shallow, every current shift in this channel so the rest of us could come home safe at night. A man whose family did that does not get erased by a woman with a newspaper interview. Sal was 64 years old. He had leased slip number 7 since he was 33. His father Manuel had leased the same slip before him, and his grandfather Joaquin before that. 3 generations of Medeiros fishermen at 3 generations of Moretti docks. That was not a business arrangement. That was a bloodline woven into another bloodline, not by marriage or birth, but by salt water and shared mornings, and the kind of trust that comes from pulling each other's nets when the weather turns ugly. I poured his coffee into Donna's favorite mug, the blue one with the chipped handle she refused to throw away, and sat down across from him. Sal told me that the families had been talking, not just the 17 who signed the letter. All 23. He said even the newer families, the ones who had only been at the harbor for 5 or 6 years, were angry. They had seen the video. They had read the article, and they knew it was a lie, because they saw me on the dock every single morning at 5:15, checking lines, inspecting hulls, greeting every captain by name, as they backed out of their slips into the gray dawn water. Sal had organized a meeting. He held it at the Portuguese-American Social Club on Prospect Street, a building with wood-paneled walls and framed photographs of fishing crews going back to the 1940s. 21 of the 23 families sent at least one representative. Bobby Tran came with his daughter, who managed the books for his trawler operation. The Herrera brothers came together, Miguel carrying a folder of receipts showing every improvement Frank Moretti had made to their slip over the past decade. Old Pete Kowalski came in a wheelchair, pushed by his grandson, a young man named Danny who worked part-time at the processing house. Rosa Benedetti, who ran the only female captain lobster boat in Gloucester, came with a handwritten list of every time I had extended her a grace period on slip fees when her catches ran thin. Sal stood at the front of the room and said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He said, "This harbor is not a piece of property. It is a community." Frank Moretti did not inherit a business. He inherited a responsibility, and he has honored it every single day for 42 years. If someone wants to take that away, they will have to go through every person in this room first. The room voted unanimously to form what Sal called the Harbor Families Coalition. Their first act was to draft a formal declaration to the Essex County Probate Court opposing the conservatorship petition. But Sal wanted more than a letter this time. He wanted testimony. He asked each family to write a personal statement describing their relationship with me, their observations of my mental and physical condition, and their dependence on the harbor for their livelihood. 17 families had already signed the initial letter. Now, all 21 present families committed to providing sworn statements. Bobby Tran's daughter, a sharp young woman named Lynn, who had graduated from Suffolk University Law School 2 years earlier, volunteered to help organize the statements into a legal filing. Vinny accepted her help gratefully. He told me later that Lynn's work was meticulous. She grouped the statements by theme: character, testimony, cognitive observation, economic dependency, community impact. She created a timeline showing that every family had interacted with me regularly and recently, demolishing Kristen's narrative that I had become isolated and confused. But something else happened at that meeting that I did not expect. After the formal discussion ended, and people were milling around with coffee cups and plates of Rosa's cornbread, Danny Kowalski approached me. He was 24 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet, the kind of young man who listened more than he spoke. He said, "Mr. Moretti, I want you to know something. I came back to Gloucester after the army because of this harbor. I did 2 tours overseas, and when I got home, I did not know what to do with myself. My grandfather told me to come work at the dock. He said, 'Frank Moretti will give you something to do with your hands, and that is the first step to finding something to do with your life.' He was right. This place saved me." I put my hand on Danny's shoulder and could not speak for a moment. Donna would have known what to say. She always did. She would have told him that the harbor did not save him, that he saved himself, and the harbor just happened to be where he was standing when he decided to keep going. I tried to say something close to that, but my voice cracked and Danny smiled and said, "It is okay, Mr. Moretti. I understand." On the drive home, Vinny told me that the coalition's filing would be powerful, but that we needed to prepare for Kristen's response. She would not stop at the petition. People who go this far do not retreat when they meet resistance. They escalate. He said we should expect a challenge to the trust itself. If Kristen could not control me through conservatorship, she would try to invalidate Donna's trust and claim the assets through Tony's marital rights. I asked Vinny if the trust could withstand that kind of attack. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Donna built it to withstand exactly that. But there is one thing I have not told you yet. She left instructions for what to do if someone challenges the trust. Specific instructions. And they involve Ruth Chen." I looked at him. The retired judge. The third trustee I had never met. Vinny nodded and said, "Donna chose her for a reason, Frank. And the reason is not what you think." I waited for him to explain, but he shook his head and said, "Not tonight. Tomorrow. Some things need the right moment." He was starting to sound like Donna. I told him so. He almost smiled. The harbor was dark when we pulled into the lot. Across the water I could see the silhouette of the Santa Lucia, rocking gently against her mooring lines. The brass key sat in my pocket. The sealed letter sat in the kitchen. The 60-day clock was ticking, and somewhere in a house I had never visited, a retired judge named Ruth Chen was waiting for a phone call that my dead wife had arranged over a year ago. Tony came to the harbor on a Thursday evening, 19 days after the wedding. I was in the processing house checking the refrigeration gauges when I heard footsteps on the concrete floor behind me. I knew it was him before I turned around. Tony walked the way his mother did. Heel first, deliberate, like every step was a sentence he had already composed in his head. I turned and saw my son standing in the doorway with his hands in his jacket pockets and his jaw set in that hard line he borrowed from me when he was a teenager and never gave back. He did not say hello. He said, "You humiliated me." I leaned against the gauge panel and let him speak. "You stood up at my wedding, in front of 300 people, in front of my wife's family, in front of my friends, and you made it about you. You made it about this dock. This rotting, rusting, fish-smelling dock that you love more than you ever loved me." His voice cracked on the last word, but he caught it fast and swallowed whatever was rising in his throat. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to pull Donna's trust documents from the office safe and spread them across the floor and say, "Look, your mother saw this coming. She knew what Kristen was planning before you even proposed." But Vinny had been clear. "Do not show Tony the trust yet. If Tony knows about the trust and tells Kristen, she will adjust her strategy. Right now, her legal approach assumes I am an aging man with no documentation and no plan. That assumption is our greatest advantage." So I stood there in the cold processing house, surrounded by the smell of brine and stainless steel, and I could not tell my son the truth. Do you understand what that feels like? To hold the one thing that might bring your child back to you, and know that handing it over would destroy the only protection your dead wife left behind. I chose Donna's plan over Tony's feelings that night. I have asked myself 1,000 times since whether that was the right decision. I still do not have a clean answer. Instead, I said, "Tony, I did not know she was going to do that." He laughed, short and bitter. "Right. You had no idea your daughter-in-law was going to ask for the dock. You had no idea. And that is why you jumped up and screamed like a lunatic in front of everyone." I told him I did not scream. He said, "It does not matter what you think you did, Dad. I have seen the video. Everyone has seen the video. The video. The edited, manipulated, carefully trimmed piece of footage that turned me into a villain." I wanted to tell him it was doctored. I wanted to explain that the original recording would show Kristen's declaration first, my measured response second, and her calculated reply third. But Vinny had said not yet to that as well. The forensic audio analysis was still in progress. A specialist named Dr. Yolanda Price at Boston University's Digital Media Lab was examining the original audio file that Vinny's investigator had obtained from a wedding guest's unedited phone backup. If I told Tony now and he confronted Kristen, she could destroy whatever remaining copies existed. Tony paced the length of the processing house. His shoes left wet prints on the concrete. He stopped near the loading bay doors and stared out at the dark harbor. I watched his back, and saw the boy who used to sit on that same loading dock with his legs dangling over the edge, eating a peanut butter sandwich while Donna tallied invoices beside him. That boy had loved this place. He used to fall asleep in the bait shop, curled up on a pile of rope, smelling like salt and engine grease. Donna would carry him to the truck and buckle him in and whisper to me, "He is going to run this harbor one day, Frankie. Just you. Watch." But Tony did not run the harbor. Tony left Gloucester at 18, went to college in Philadelphia, studied finance, took a job in Hartford, and built a life that had nothing to do with fish or docks or the smell of diesel at dawn. He came back for holidays, then for Donna's funeral. Then not at all until Kristen. I never blamed him for leaving. A son is not obligated to want what his father wants, but I would be lying if I said it did not hollow me out. Year after year, watching those slips fill up every morning with other men's sons, he turned back to me and said, "Kristen is not the enemy here, Dad. She sees what I have been afraid to say out loud. You are getting older. This place is too much for one person. All she wanted was to help you transition, and you reacted like she was trying to rob you." I kept my face still. Transition. That was the word they were using. Not takeover. Not seizure. Transition. A soft word for a hard thing. The same way they called Donna's dying a journey instead of what it actually was, which was my wife, disappearing one piece at a time while I sat beside her bed and held a hand that got lighter every week. I said, "Tony, I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer honestly." He stiffened but nodded. "Before you met Kristen, did you ever once ask me about the harbor? Did you ever call and say, 'Dad, how is the business? Do you need help? Are you managing?'" He opened his mouth, then closed it. I said, "Because in the 6 years between your mother's diagnosis and the wedding, you called me 11 times. I know because I counted." Donna counted too. She kept a log by the phone, a little notebook where she marked every time you called with the date and how many minutes we talked. 11 calls in 6 years. The longest was 14 minutes. The shortest was 3. Tony's face changed. The hard jaw loosened. His eyes went somewhere far away, somewhere I could not reach. He said, "That is not fair." I said, "I am not trying to be fair. I am trying to understand why the harbor suddenly matters to you now when it did not matter to you for the last 20 years. He left without answering. He walked out through the loading bay, and I watched him cross the gravel lot and get into his car and sit there for a long time with the engine off. Then the headlights came on, and he pulled away, and the harbor was quiet again except for the water lapping against the pilings and the distant clang of a channel marker buoy. I locked up the processing house and walked to the end of the dock. The Santa Lucia sat in her slip, patient and still. The brass key weighed heavy in my pocket. I thought about Donna's notebook by the phone. 11 calls. She had counted every single one, not to punish Tony, not to build a case, but because she was a woman who believed that the truth lives in numbers, and numbers do not lie, and one day those numbers would matter. I pulled out my phone and called Vinny. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Tony came by." Vinny said, "I know. How did it go?" I said, "He left without hearing what he needed to hear." Vinny was quiet. Then he said, "There is something you should know. Ruth Chen called me this afternoon. She said she is ready." I asked, "Ready for what?" He said, "Ready to do what Donna asked her to do." Ruth Chen lived in a white clapboard house on a hillside in Rockport, 7 miles north of Gloucester. The house overlooked the Atlantic and had a garden full of hydrangeas that she tended herself despite being 76 years old with 2 replaced knees. Vinny drove me there on a Saturday morning, 23 days after the wedding. The air smelled like rain and cut grass. I remember thinking Donna would have loved that garden. Ruth opened the door before we knocked. She was shorter than I expected, maybe 5 feet 2, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Her handshake was firm and brief. She looked at me the way a judge looks at a witness, not unkindly, but with an attention that made me feel like every word I said would be weighed and measured and filed somewhere permanent. She led us into a study lined with bookshelves, legal volumes mostly, but also poetry. I noticed a collection of Mary Oliver on the shelf nearest her desk. Donna had loved Mary Oliver. She used to read her poems aloud on Sunday mornings while I made eggs. I almost mentioned it but stopped myself. I did not know this woman yet. Ruth poured tea and sat behind her desk. She opened a drawer and pulled out a folder with a label in handwriting I recognized instantly. Donna's handwriting, the same slight upward slant, the same neat capitals. The label read, Ruth Chen, Trustee 3, open upon activation. Ruth said, "Your wife came to see me 15 months ago." She sat in that same chair. She brought this folder, a box of documents, and a lemon cake she had baked that morning. We talked for 4 hours, 15 months. 1 month before Donna went to Vinny. She had gone to Ruth first, secured the person before building the structure. That was always Donna's way. Ruth explained that Donna had reviewed the public records of every retired probate judge in Essex County and narrowed the list to 3. The first declined involvement. The second had a consulting relationship with a real estate firm that Donna considered a conflict. Ruth was the third. No conflicts, no business ties, and a 22-year record of protecting family assets from predatory claims. But Donna chose Ruth for another reason. During their conversation, Donna asked a question that had nothing to do with law. She asked, "Judge Chen, have you ever lost someone and then discovered they left you something you did not expect?" Ruth paused before answering. Then she told Donna about her husband James, who died 8 years earlier from pancreatic cancer. 6 months after his death, Ruth found a letter inside a book of Mary Oliver poetry on his nightstand. James had known about the diagnosis for 3 months before telling her and had spent that time quietly arranging everything so she would not have to make a single difficult decision while grieving. He updated their will, prepaid the mortgage, and wrote letters to each of their daughters. Ruth said when Donna heard this story, she smiled and said, "Then you understand exactly what I am doing." Ruth agreed to serve as trustee that afternoon. I sat in that study and felt something I had not felt since the funeral. Donna's presence. Not in a mystical way, but in the way a person's decisions carry their voice forward, long after they stop breathing. She was in that folder, in Ruth's study, in the hydrangea garden she would have admired. Ruth opened the folder and walked us through 3 sections. The first contained detailed financial records for the harbor going back 7 years. Revenue reports, expense logs, lease agreements, maintenance invoices. Donna organized them chronologically and cross-referenced every entry. The second section was what Ruth called the anomaly file. Donna had flagged 17 transactions over a 2-year period that she could not reconcile. Small amounts at first. A few hundred here, 1,000 there. But they accumulated. The total discrepancy was $75,000. I felt my stomach drop. I had never noticed. After Donna got sick, I hired a part-time bookkeeper named Gwen Hadley to manage the accounts. Gwen came recommended by Tony. Tony met Gwen through Kristen. Ruth watched my face as the realization settled. Vinny said, "Donna flagged these discrepancies 11 months before the wedding. She believed someone was siphoning money in amounts small enough to avoid detection. She could not prove who. But she noted that the irregularities began exactly 3 months after Gwen took over the books. The third section was a single sheet of paper. 4 names: Kristen Vale, Colin Draper, Ryan Prescott, Meridian Coastal Group. Next to each name, Donna had written a date and a note. Next to Kristen, she wrote, "Background check incomplete. Recommend full investigation." Next to Colin Draper, first husband, divorced 2017. Circumstances unclear. Next to Ryan Prescott, commercial real estate, Boston and North Shore. Possible connection to Kristen. Next to Meridian Coastal Group. Research pending, registered in Delaware. No visible Massachusetts presence. Donna had not finished. The cancer took her before she could connect the dots. But she had drawn the first lines of a map and placed it in the hands of a woman who spent 22 years reading maps exactly like it. Ruth closed the folder. She said, "Your wife was one of the most methodical people I have ever met. She anticipated that someone would try to take this harbor through your son. She could not prove it, but she prepared for it. My job is to finish what she started." Vinny said, "We need a forensic accountant. Someone independent, not connected to Gloucester or any name in that file." Ruth nodded. She said, "I have someone. Her name is Elena Navarro. She works out of Providence. She is very good, and she does not scare easily." I heard that name for the first time in Ruth Chen's study on a rainy Saturday morning, and I did not yet know how much it would come to matter. Elena Navarro arrived in Gloucester on a Tuesday morning, 31 days after the wedding. She drove a silver sedan with Rhode Island plates and carried a single black messenger bag that looked like it had survived a decade of audits. Vinny met her at the harbor gate and brought her to the office above the processing house, the same office where Donna used to work late into the night with a desk lamp and a calculator that clicked like a metronome. Elena was 43 years old, compact and sharp-featured, with dark eyes that moved across a room the way a lighthouse beam sweeps water. She shook my hand without smiling and said, "Mr. Moretti, I need access to every financial record this harbor has produced in the last 5 years. Bank statements, tax filings, payroll records, vendor invoices, lease agreements, insurance claims, and any correspondence related to accounts payable or receivable. I need them by tomorrow morning." I told her she could have them by tonight. She almost smiled at that. Vinny had given Elena the anomaly file from Donna's folder. She read it on the drive from Providence and told Vinny that whoever compiled it had a gift for forensic pattern recognition. She did not know then that the compiler was a dying woman working against a clock she could hear but never slowed. Elena sat up in the office and worked for 6 days straight. She arrived at 7 each morning and left after 10 each night. She ate lunch at her desk, usually a sandwich from the deli on Main Street, and drank black coffee from a thermos she refilled twice a day at the bait shop, where Rosa Benedetti kept a pot going for the early cruise. Rosa told me the accountant lady does not talk much, but she tips well. On the 7th day, Elena called a meeting. Vinny, Ruth Chen, and I sat around the desk while Elena opened her laptop and turned the screen toward us. She had built a spreadsheet that mapped every dollar that moved through the harbor accounts over the past 3 years. Income streams were coded green. Operating expenses were coded blue. And scattered across the spreadsheet, like drops of blood on a white cloth, were transactions coded red. She said, "The discrepancy your wife identified was $75,000. She was close, but conservative. The actual figure is $81,400. The siphoning method was simple but disciplined. Gwen Hadley created a series of vendor accounts for maintenance services that do not exist. Fictional companies with real-sounding names. North Shore Marine Coatings, Essex Dock Repair Incorporated, Cape Ann Fuel Services LLC. Each company submitted invoices monthly for amounts between $800 and $2,000. The invoices were formatted professionally with logos, reference numbers, and payment terms. But none of these companies are registered with the Massachusetts Secretary of State. None have tax identification numbers. None have physical addresses." End quote. The payments went to 3 separate bank accounts, all opened within a 2-month window at branches in Salem, Peabody, and Beverly. I stared at the red marks on the screen and felt something between nausea and rage. Someone had been stealing from the harbor while I grieved for my wife. While I stood on that dock every morning at 5:15 thinking I was holding everything together, money was bleeding out through holes. I could not see, because a woman I trusted was drilling them in the dark. Elena continued. She said, "I traced the 3 bank accounts. They are all controlled by a single entity. a limited liability company registered in Delaware called Vail and Prescott Ventures. I heard Ruth shift in her chair. Vail. Kristen's maiden name. Prescott. The third name on Donna's list. Elena pulled up a corporate filing document from the Delaware Division of Corporations. Vail and Prescott Ventures, LLC, was registered 18 months ago. Its managing members were listed as Kristen A. Vail and Ryan M. Prescott. Vinny asked who Ryan Prescott was. Elena said she had spent 2 days researching him. Ryan Prescott was the founder and managing director of Meridian Coastal Group, a commercial real estate development firm based in Boston with a focus on waterfront properties. Meridian had completed 14 projects along the New England coast in the past decade, converting working waterfronts into luxury marina complexes, boutique hotels, and high-end residential developments. Their most recent project was a $40 million marina conversion in Kennebunkport, Maine. Ruth said, "They want to turn this harbor into a resort." Elena nodded. She said, "Based on the financial trail, I believe the plan has 3 phases. Phase 1 is financial destabilization. Siphon money from the harbor accounts to create the appearance of mismanagement and declining revenue. Phase 2 is legal control. Use the conservatorship petition to gain authority over Frank and the harbor assets. Phase 3 is acquisition. Once control is established, transfer the harbor assets to Vail and Prescott Ventures, which then sells or develops the property in partnership with Meridian Coastal Group. I thought about Kristen at the wedding, standing at the microphone, calm and poised, announcing my harbor as a gift while 300 people watched. That was not a spontaneous moment. That was phase 2 going public ahead of schedule. She had expected me to be weaker by then. She had expected the financial bleeding to have done more damage. She had expected Donna to be gone and forgotten, and no one left to check the numbers. But Donna checked the numbers. Donna always checked the numbers. Elena closed her laptop and said, "Mr. Moretti, I need to tell you something important. The evidence I have found is sufficient for a civil case. Fraud, embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty. But if you want criminal charges, we need more. We need to connect Gwen Hadley directly to Kristen and Prescott. Right now, the link is circumstantial. Same last name on the LLC. Same timeline. Same financial benefit. But a good defense attorney could argue coincidence. I need Gwen's communications. Emails, texts, anything that shows she was directed by Kristen or Prescott to create those fake vendors." Vinny said, "How do we get those?" Elena looked at him with those lighthouse eyes and said, "We ask Gwen. People who commit small crimes on behalf of powerful people usually do not realize they are disposable until someone tells them. I intend to tell her." I looked out the window at the harbor below. The boats rocked gently in their slips. The 23 families were out there somewhere, trusting that this dock would be here tomorrow. Donna had counted the money. Elena had followed it. Now someone had to confront the woman who moved it. The brass key still sat in my pocket, unused. The sealed letter still waited in the kitchen, and the clock on the wall said 38 days since the wedding, 22 days left on the conservatorship timeline. Elena met Gwen Hadley at a coffee shop in Beverly on a Wednesday afternoon, 34 days after the wedding. She chose Beverly deliberately. Neutral ground, far enough from Gloucester that no one from the harbor families would see them, close enough that Gwen would not suspect anything unusual about the location. Elena told me later that she ordered a black coffee and a blueberry muffin and sat near the window so Gwen would have to walk past her to reach the counter. She wanted to watch how the woman moved before she spoke to her. Gwen was 36 years old, thin, with light brown hair cut short and nervous hands that never stopped moving. She ordered a latte, sat down across from Elena, and immediately asked why a forensic accountant from Providence wanted to speak with her about a part-time bookkeeping job at a fishing harbor. Elena said, "Because 3 fake companies have been billing that harbor for services they never provided, and every payment was authorized by you." Gwen's face went white. Not slowly. Instantly. Like someone had pulled a plug at the base of her throat and drained all the color out in one motion. She set her latte down, and her hand trembled badly enough that coffee sloshed over the rim onto the table. She said, "I do not know what you are talking about." Elena opened her messenger bag and placed 3 documents on the table between them. The first was an invoice from North Shore Marine Coatings for $1,400 dated 7 months ago. The second was a bank deposit record showing that exact amount entering an account controlled by Vail and Prescott Ventures the following business day. The third was a screenshot of the Vail and Prescott Ventures LLC filing from Delaware, with Kristen Vail's name highlighted in yellow. Elena said, "Gwen, I am going to be honest with you, because I think honesty is something you have not received much of recently. You are not a criminal mastermind. You are a bookkeeper who was asked to do something by someone you trusted, and you did it without fully understanding where it led. I know this because a criminal mastermind would not have used sequential invoice numbers for 3 fictional companies. You numbered them in order. North Shore started at 1001. Essex Dock Repair started at 2001. Cape Ann Fuel started at 3001. Every month, each company's invoice went up by 1. A professional would have randomized the numbers. You did not because you were not trying to be clever. You were trying to keep track." Gwen stared at the documents. Then she started crying. Not dramatic sobs, but quiet tears that ran down her cheeks and dripped onto the invoice from North Shore Marine Coatings. She said, "Kristen told me it was temporary. She said Frank was losing money because he was too old to manage the books properly and that Tony wanted to restructure the finances before taking over. She said the vendor accounts were a way to redirect funds into a transition account so nothing would be lost during the handover. She said it was Tony's idea." Elena asked, "Did Tony ever confirm that to you directly?" Gwen shook her head. She said, "I never spoke to Tony about it. Kristen handled everything. She gave me the company names, the bank account numbers, and the invoice templates. She told me how much to bill each month and when to submit. I asked once if I should talk to Frank about it, and she said absolutely not. He would not understand. His mind is not what it used to be." Elena told me that at this point, Gwen looked up from the table and said something that changed the shape of the entire case. She said, "There is something else. Something Kristen does not know I saw. About 2 months ago, I went to Kristen's apartment in Salem to drop off a flash drive with the latest invoice files. She was not home, but the door was unlocked, and she had told me before to leave things on the kitchen counter if she was out. I walked in, and there was a man sitting at the dining table with a laptop open and a stack of papers. He looked surprised to see me. He said Kristen would be back in 20 minutes. I set the flash drive on the counter and left, but as I was walking out, I glanced at the laptop screen. There was a presentation open, a slide deck. The title slide said, "Gloucester Harbor Redevelopment, Phase 3, Meridian Coastal Group." There was an image of the harbor, our harbor, rendered as a luxury marina with white boats and a hotel where the processing house stands now. Elena asked if Gwen could identify the man. Gwen said she had never seen him before but described him as tall, mid-40s, dark hair, wearing a navy blazer. Elena showed her a photograph of Ryan Prescott pulled from the Meridian Coastal Group website. Gwen confirmed it was the same person. Elena called Vinny that evening from her car. Vinny called me. I was sitting on the back porch watching the last light fade over the harbor. He said, "Frank, we have a witness who can place Ryan Prescott at Kristen's apartment with a development plan for your harbor on his screen. Combined with the financial evidence and the LLC filing, this is no longer circumstantial. This is a conspiracy to defraud." I asked what happens next. Vinny said, 2 things. First, Elena is going to ask Gwen to provide a sworn affidavit detailing everything she just described. Second, I am going to contact a friend at the United States Attorney's Office in Boston. This has crossed the line from a family dispute into federal territory. Wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse. These are not state charges, Frank. These are federal. I sat on that porch and listened to the harbor sounds. Water against wood. A halyard clinking against a mast somewhere in the dark. The low hum of the cold storage compressor. These were the sounds Donna fell asleep to on summer nights when we left the bedroom windows open. These were the sounds someone wanted to replace with valet parking and cocktail music. I asked Vinny one more question. Does Tony know about any of this? The Prescott meeting. The development plan. The fake vendors. Vinny was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is what we need to find out. Because if Tony knew, this is a family tragedy. And if he did not, it is something else entirely." I hung up and looked across the water at the Santa Lucia. The brass key pressed against my thigh through my pocket. 26 days left. And somewhere in Salem, Gwen Hadley was sitting alone in her apartment, realizing for the first time that the woman who told her everything would be fine had never once told her the truth. I went to the Santa Lucia on a Friday night, 37 days after the wedding. I went alone. Vinny had told me to wait. Ruth had told me to wait. Even Elena, who had known me for less than 2 weeks, said, "Mr. Moretti, whatever is on that boat has waited 5 years. It can wait a few more days." But I could not wait any longer. The brass key had been in my pocket for 14 days, and it had started to feel less like metal and more like a voice. Donna's voice. Quiet, patient, but insistent in the way she always was when she knew something I did not. The dock was empty at 11 at night. The harbor lights cast long reflections across the black water, like yellow ribbons laid on glass. I walked past slip after slip, past Bobby Tran's trawler, and the Herrera Brothers gillnetter and Rosa Benedetti's lobster boat with its faded red hull. The Santa Lucia sat at the far end, in slip 23. The last slip, the one my grandfather Giuseppe claimed the day he bought this dock in 1951, because he said a captain should always be able to see the open ocean from where his boat sleeps. She was a 42-foot wooden fishing vessel, built in 1948, in a boatyard in Marsala, Sicily. Giuseppe sailed her across the Atlantic with a crew of 4 men and a boy who was my father. The crossing took 31 days. My father told me once that on the 22nd night, a storm nearly capsized them, and Giuseppe tied himself to the helm and steered for 9 hours straight, while the boy who would become my father crouched in the cabin and prayed to every saint whose name he could remember. They arrived in Gloucester Harbor on a Tuesday morning in October, with the hull leaking and the engine coughing, and Giuseppe standing at the bow waving an American flag he had purchased in the Azores during a fuel stop. The boat had not been used in 5 years. After Donna got sick, I stopped maintaining her. I told myself it was because I did not have time, but the truth was simpler and uglier. The Santa Lucia was where I proposed to Donna. I knelt on the deck on a September evening in 1981 with a ring I had bought from a jeweler in Salem for $340. She said yes before I finished the question. We spent our wedding night on that boat, anchored in a cove north of Rockport, listening to the water and talking about what our children would look like. Going aboard after she died felt like walking into a room where her ghost would be sitting in the captain's chair, smiling at me with that smile that made the entire Atlantic seem small. I stepped onto the deck and felt the wood groan under my weight. The salt air was heavy and still. I moved carefully to the starboard side and found the cabinet built into the wall below the helm station. The bottom drawer. I knelt down, inserted the brass key, and turned it. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed too loud for the quiet harbor. Inside the drawer, I found a waterproof case, the kind divers use to protect documents from moisture. I carried it back onto the dock and sat on the piling under the nearest light. I opened the case and found 4 items. The first was a leather-bound notebook, dark brown, about the size of a paperback novel. The cover was blank, but the pages inside were filled with Donna's handwriting. Dates, names, numbers, observations. It was a research journal. She had been investigating Kristen on her own, long before she went to Ruth or Vinny. The first entry was dated 20 months before the wedding. The second item was a USB flash drive in a small plastic bag with a label that read, "Copies of all digital files, updated monthly through final entry." The third was a sealed envelope addressed to Tony. Not to me. Totone. Donna's handwriting on the front, his name in her careful capitals, and below it a single line that read, "Open this when your father tells you it is time." The fourth item was a photograph. It showed a younger Kristen, maybe 5 or 6 years earlier, standing on a boat dock that was not in Gloucester. She was smiling, her arm around a man I did not recognize. On the back of the photograph, Donna had written, "Kristen Vale and Colin Draper, Marblehead, 2016. 1 year before their divorce." I held the photograph under the light and studied the man's face. Colin Draper. The first husband from Donna's list. The one whose entry read, "Divorce 2017. Circumstances unclear." Donna had found a photograph of them together. She had found it, printed it, and locked it inside a boat that no one else would think to search. She was building a case. Not a legal case. A mother's case. Evidence gathered not for a courtroom but for the moment her son would need to see the truth about the woman he married. I opened the notebook and read the first entry. It was dated 20 months before the wedding, and it said, "Tony brought a woman to dinner tonight. Her name is Kristen Vale. She asked 3 questions about the harbor before she asked 1 question about Tony. I do not trust her. I am going to find out why." I closed the notebook. My hands were shaking again, the same way they shook when Vinny first showed me the trust. But this was different. The trust was Donna protecting the harbor. This notebook was Donna protecting her son. She knew Tony would not listen to her suspicions. She knew he would call her paranoid or jealous or old-fashioned. So she did what she always did. She gathered the numbers. She documented the patterns. She locked the evidence in a place only I could reach and trusted that I would know when the time was right. I put everything back in the waterproof case except the photograph that I slipped into my jacket pocket next to where the brass key used to live. The key's job was done. Now the photograph had work to do. I walked back along the dock, past the sleeping boats and the dark processing house, and I called Vinny. He answered on the first ring, which meant he had been waiting. I said, "I opened it." He said, "What did she leave?" I said, "Everything." I mailed the Colin Draper file to Tony on a Monday morning, 40 days after the wedding. Not the original. Vinny had Elena make certified copies of everything. The photograph, 6 pages from Donna's notebook covering her research on Draper, the Delaware LLC filing for Vale and Prescott Ventures, and a printout of Draper's divorce records from Marblehead District Court that Elena obtained through a public records request. I put it all in a plain manila envelope with no return address and drove to the post office in Ipswich, 20 minutes north of Gloucester, because I did not want anyone at the local office to see me send it. I did not include a note. I did not write Tony's name on the inside. I just sent the documents and let them speak for themselves, the way Donna would have. She always said that evidence does not need an introduction. It only needs to arrive. Elena had spent 3 days building the Draper file. Colin Draper was 41 years old, an insurance adjuster from Marblehead who married Kristen Vale in 2015. The marriage lasted 22 months. During the divorce proceedings, Draper's attorney filed a motion alleging that Kristen had systematically transferred marital assets into accounts Draper could not access. She opened 2 joint credit lines without his knowledge, took cash advances totaling $38,000, and funneled the money into an account held by a company Draper had never heard of. The company was called Vale Property Solutions LLC, registered in Delaware, managed by Kristen A. Vale. The pattern was identical. Different state, different man, different company name, same structure, same method, same woman. Draper's divorce was finalized in 2017. He lost 35% of his assets, despite the fraud allegations, because his attorney could not definitively prove where the money went. The Delaware LLC had been dissolved by the time the court issued its discovery orders. Kristen walked away with the house, a settlement payment, and a clean record. Draper moved to New Hampshire and, according to Elena's research, had not remarried. Elena also found Draper's sister. Her name was Janet Draper Rooney. She lived in Swampscott, 15 minutes from Gloucester. Janet had been vocal during the divorce, posting on social media about what she called her brother's financial abuse at the hands of a woman who married for access, not love. Elena contacted Janet by phone, and Janet agreed to speak. She said she had been waiting 5 years for someone to call her about Kristen Vale. Janet told Elena that Kristen had targeted Colin deliberately. They met at a charity event in Boston, where Colin was volunteering for a nonprofit that helped underinsured families. Kristen approached him, asked about his work, expressed deep interest in community service. Within 3 months, she moved into his apartment. Within 8 months, they were married. Within a year, the money started disappearing. Janet said she tried to warn Colin, but he would not listen. She said, "When you are in love with someone like Kristen, the truth sounds like jealousy." That sentence stayed with me. When you are in love with someone like Kristen, the truth sounds like jealousy. I thought about Tony. I thought about every conversation Donna might have tried to have with him before she got sick. I thought about how a mother's warning would have sounded to a grown son who had finally found someone who made him feel chosen. Donna knew. She knew her words would bounce off Tony's certainty like rain off a tarp. So she stopped talking and started documenting. The envelope reached Tony on a Wednesday. I know because Vinny had asked the postal inspector's office to confirm delivery as part of the legal record. Tony did not call me that day. He did not call the next day either. On Friday, 3 days after receiving the envelope, Tony called Vinny. "Not me. Vinny," he said. "Where did these documents come from?" Vinny said. "From someone who cares about you." Tony said, "This is about Kristen's first marriage." Vinny said, "Yes." Tony said, "She told me about Colin. She said he was controlling, and she had to protect herself financially." Vinny asked, "Did she mention the Delaware LLC?" Tony was silent. Vinny asked, "Did she mention that the same structure, a Delaware LLC with her maiden name in the title, now controls the bank accounts that received $81,000 stolen from your father's harbor?" Tony hung up. Vinny called me and relayed the conversation. I stood at the kitchen window looking at the harbor and felt something I did not expect. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Sadness. My son had just received evidence that the woman he loved was not who she claimed to be, and instead of processing it, he called a lawyer to ask where it came from. He was not ready to see. He was looking at the envelope when he should have been looking at what was inside it. 2 days later, something happened that none of us anticipated. Tony went to Kristen and showed her the documents. He confronted her directly. He asked about Colin Draper, about Vale Property Solutions, about Vale and Prescott Ventures. Kristen did not deny the first marriage. She could not. Public records are public. But she told Tony a version of the story so polished and so practiced that it could only have been prepared in advance. She said Colin was abusive. She said the LLC was her escape fund. She said she dissolved it because she wanted a fresh start. She said the current LLC, Vale and Prescott Ventures, was an investment vehicle she created with a business associate named Ryan Prescott for a small real estate project that had nothing to do with the harbor. Then she played an audio recording. She held up her phone and played a clip of a man's voice saying, "I never wanted that boy to have this harbor. He does not deserve it." The voice sounded like mine. Tony listened to it and left the room without speaking. Vinny received a call from Kristen's attorney the next morning. The attorney said that Tony Moretti supported the conservatorship petition and would testify at the hearing in favor of appointing a legal conservator over his father. The attorney also said that Kristen had filed a supplemental motion including an audio recording, allegedly demonstrating Frank Moretti's hostility toward his own son and his diminished judgment. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the 3 objects still lined up from weeks ago. The conservatorship petition, now reinforced. Donna's sealed letter, still unread. And the envelope addressed to Tony that I had taken from the Santa Lucia, still sealed. Still waiting for the moment I would tell him it was time. Vinny called and said, "Frank." She played a fake audio. "Elena is already sending the file to Dr. Yolanda Price at Boston University. If it is fabricated, Price will prove it. But we have lost Tony for now. He believes what he heard." I looked at the envelope with Tony's name in Donna's handwriting. Not yet. Donna had written on the card, "Open this when your father tells you it is time." The time was not now. Tony needed to hear fake words before he could believe real ones. He needed to reach the bottom of Kristen's lie before Donna's truth could pull him back up. I set the envelope down and said, "How many days?" Vinny said, 14. Dr. Yolanda Price worked in a basement laboratory at Boston University's College of Communication. The room was windowless, climate-controlled, and lined with acoustic panels that absorbed every sound except the hum of her equipment. Vinny drove me there on a Thursday afternoon, 44 days after the wedding, 16 days before the conservatorship hearing. Elena came with us. She brought a copy of the audio file that Kristen's attorney had submitted to the court as a supplemental exhibit. Dr. Price was 51 years old, tall, with close-cropped gray hair and a calm precision in every movement that reminded me of a surgeon. She had spent 23 years analyzing audio for federal courts, intelligence agencies, and media organizations. She had testified in over 60 cases involving manipulated recordings. Vinny told me on the drive that if Yolanda Price says a recording is fake, no judge in Massachusetts will question it. She played the audio for us first without comment. The clip was 11 seconds long. A man's voice, rough, tired, speaking with what sounded like restrained anger. "I never wanted that boy to have this harbor. He does not deserve it." The words hit me the same way they must have hit Tony. They sounded like me. The cadence was mine. The vowels carried the same slight New England compression I have never been able to shake. If someone played that recording without context, I would have believed it was my voice too. Dr. Price replayed it 3 times while watching waveform patterns on her monitor. Then she opened a second file, a recording of my voice that Elena had made during our first meeting in the harbor office. A baseline sample. Price played the 2 recordings side by side. The waveforms stacked vertically on her screen, like 2 rivers flowing in the same direction but with different currents. She pointed to the screen and began explaining. She said, "The fundamental frequency of the submitted recording is consistent with your voice, Mr. Moretti. Whoever created this used a genuine sample of you speaking as a source. But there are 3 markers that confirm manipulation. First, the spectral envelope. When a person speaks naturally, the harmonic overtones shift fluidly between syllables. In this recording, the overtones between the word boy and the word have shown a discontinuity, a micro gap of approximately 40 milliseconds where the frequency pattern resets. That does not happen in natural speech. It happens when 2 separate audio segments are spliced together. She zoomed into the waveform and pointed at a section that looked to my untrained eye like a tiny crack in a wall. She said, "Second, the ambient noise floor. Every recording carries background sound, room tone, air conditioning, electrical hum. In a continuous recording, the noise floor remains constant. In this file, the noise floor shifts at 2 points. Here, between never and wanted. And here, between harbor and he. These shifts indicate that the words were recorded in at least 3 different acoustic environments and then assembled into a single clip." Elena leaned forward and asked about the 3rd marker. Price nodded and said, "The 3rd is the most damning. Breath pattern. When a person speaks a sentence of this length, they take a preparatory breath before beginning and may take a micro breath at a natural pause point. This recording has no preparatory breath. The sentence begins at full vocal energy with no inhalation. That is physically impossible for a 70-year-old male speaking with this level of emotional intensity. Someone trimmed the breath to clean the edit point. Price turned to me and said, Mr. Moretti, this recording is a composite. Someone took fragments of your voice from multiple sources and assembled them into a sentence you never spoke. The construction is competent but not professional grade. I would estimate it was made using commercially available audio editing software by someone with moderate technical skill. I asked her if she could determine where the original voice samples came from. She said, "Not definitively, but I can tell you that the source recordings were made in different environments. At least one segment was recorded outdoors, based on the wind noise residue in the lower frequencies. Another was recorded in a room with hard surfaces, possibly tile or concrete. The third is consistent with a phone call recording, based on the compression artifacts. I thought about that. Outdoor. Hard surfaces. Phone call. Someone had been recording me without my knowledge in multiple locations. At the dock. In the processing house. On the phone. I felt a cold anger settle in my chest, different from the hot rage I felt at the wedding. This was quiet and still, like the water in the harbor before a storm. Elena asked Price to prepare a formal expert report suitable for submission to Essex County Probate Court. Price said she could have it ready in 5 business days. She also said she would include a technical appendix with spectrograms, frequency analysis charts, and a plain language summary that a non-expert judge could understand. Vinny thanked her and said we needed it in 4 days. Price looked at him over her glasses and said, "4 days is fine. I do not sleep much anyway." On the drive back to Gloucester, Vinny outlined our position for the hearing. We had Dr. Firth's competency evaluation, confirming my full mental capacity. We had the Harbor Families Coalition statements from 21 families attesting to my character and cognition. We had Elena's forensic accounting report documenting $81,400 in embezzlement through fictional vendor accounts linked to Kristen's Delaware LLC. We had Gwen Hadley's sworn affidavit describing Kristen's direction of the scheme. We had Janet Draper Rooney's willingness to testify about Kristen's identical pattern with Colin Draper. We had Gwen's identification of Ryan Prescott at Kristen's apartment with the Harbor redevelopment presentation, and now we had Dr. Price's analysis proving the audio recording was fabricated. 7 layers of evidence. Donna had built the first 3. Elena had built the next 2. The community had built 1. And the last one, Kristen had built herself by submitting a fake recording to a court of law. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the coastline pass. The Atlantic was gray and calm. Fishing boats moved slowly toward the harbor, their running lights blinking against the dusk. Somewhere in those boats were men and women from the 23 families who did not know how close they had come to losing their livelihoods because a woman in a white dress decided their harbor would look better with a hotel and Valletstand. Vinny said, "Frank, there is one more thing we should discuss before the hearing. The envelope. The one Donna left for Tony on the Santa Lucia. I know you have been waiting for the right moment." He paused. "I think the right moment is the night before Tony walks into that courtroom. Let him read his mother's words before he sits across from you and testifies against you. Let Donna speak to her son one last time." I did not answer right away. I looked at the ocean and thought about Donna sitting at the kitchen table, writing that letter by hand, knowing she would not be alive to deliver it. I thought about what it cost her to put those words on paper instead of speaking them aloud. I thought about the trust it took to believe that I would know when the time was right. I said, "Not the night before. The morning of. Let him wake up with her voice in his head." Vinny nodded slowly and said, "The morning of." I drove to Tony's apartment in Salem at 5:30 in the morning on the day of the hearing. The streets were empty. The sky was that color it gets before sunrise in New England. Not dark and not light, but something in between. Like the ocean, holding its breath. I parked across the street and sat in my truck for 11 minutes. I know because I counted. I counted the way Donna counted. Every second deliberate. Every number meaning something. Tony lived on the 3rd floor of a brick building on Essex Street. Kristen's apartment was 2 blocks away. They had not moved in together yet. That detail mattered to me more than it should have. Some part of my son had kept a distance. A small one. A gap that Kristen had not yet closed. Whether that gap was doubt or habit, or something Donna planted before she died, I could not say. But it was there. I climbed the stairs and stood outside his door. I could hear a television on low volume inside. He was awake. I placed the envelope on the doormat. The same envelope Donna had sealed and hidden in the Santa Lucia. The one addressed to Tony in her careful capitals with the line beneath his name that read, "Open this. When your father tells you it is time." I knocked twice and walked back down the stairs without waiting. I was in my truck with the engine running when I saw his window. A light moved across the ceiling inside. Probably his phone, flashlight. Then, stillness. I imagined him opening the door, seeing the envelope on the mat, recognizing his mother's handwriting. I imagined his hands trembling the way mine did when I first saw that same handwriting on the folder in Ruth Chen's study. I imagined him sitting on the edge of his bed, turning the envelope over, reading the line she wrote for him, and deciding whether to open it or set it aside. I drove to Vinny's office on Main Street in Gloucester. He was already there with Elena and Ruth. The hearing was scheduled for 10 in the morning at Essex County Probate Court in Salem. Vinny had organized our evidence into 7 sections, each in its own tabbed binder. He walked us through the presentation order one final time. First, Dr. Firth's competency report. Second, the Harbor Families Coalition statements. Third, Elena's forensic accounting report. Fourth, Gwen Hadley's sworn affidavit. Fifth, Janet Draper Rooney's testimony about Kristen's prior marriage. Sixth, Gwen's identification of Ryan Prescott and the Meridian Coastal presentation. Seventh, Dr. Price's audio fabrication analysis. Ruth would attend as the third trustee, representing the trust's interests independently from my personal defense. Elena would be available to testify on the financial evidence if called. Vinny told me to say as little as possible on the stand. Answer what is asked. Do not volunteer. Do not argue. Let the evidence speak. He said, "Frank, Donna built this case from her deathbed. The best thing you can do today is let her finish what she started." We arrived at the courthouse at 9:15. The building was old granite, built in the 1870s, with high ceilings and wooden benches that creaked when you sat down. I had never been inside a courtroom before. I had spent my entire life settling things on the dock, with handshakes and raised voices, and the understanding that a man's word was his bond. This was different. This was a room where words were weighed on scales I could not see. Kristen arrived at 9:30 with her attorney, a man named Gerald Voss from a Boston firm that specialized in family law and estate disputes. Voss was tall, gray-haired, impeccably dressed, and moved through the courtroom like he owned the floorboards. Kristen sat behind him wearing a navy blue dress and an expression of composed sorrow that I recognized from the Boston Globe photograph. The same folded hands, the same soft eyes, the same performance. Tony arrived at 9:42. I watched him walk through the courtroom doors, and I knew immediately that he had read the letter. His face was different. Not angry. Not defiant. Something had cracked behind his eyes. Something structural, like a beam inside a house that shifts just enough to change the way every door hangs. He did not look at Kristen when he sat down. He sat in the second row on her side of the courtroom, but he left an empty seat between them. A gap. The same gap he had kept by not moving into her apartment, but wider now. The judge was the Honorable Patricia Leung, a 17-year veteran of Essex County Probate Court. She called the hearing to order at 10:03. Voss presented the conservatorship petition first. He described a concerned daughter-in-law witnessing the gradual decline of a beloved patriarch. He described erratic behavior, financial confusion, public outbursts. He played the audio recording, 11 seconds of a voice that sounded like mine saying words I never spoke. The courtroom was silent while it played. I kept my eyes on Tony. He was staring at his hands. Then it was Vinny's turn. He stood up slowly, buttoned his jacket, and said, "Your Honor, what you have just heard is not Frank Moretti's voice. It is a fabrication assembled from secretly recorded fragments of his speech. And I can prove it." He opened the first binder. The room shifted. I could feel it. The way you feel a tide change before you see the water move. Something in the air turned. And for the first time since the wedding, the current was flowing in our direction. Vinny placed Dr. Firth's report on the evidence table and said, "I would like to begin with the truth about Frank Moretti's mind. Then I would like to show this court the truth about his harbor. And then, Your Honor, I would like to show you the truth about the woman who claims she is trying to protect him." I glanced at Tony. He had lifted his eyes from his hands and was looking at Vinny. Not at Kristen. Not at me. At Vinny. And in that look, I saw something I had not seen in my son's face in years. I saw a man who was ready to listen. Vinny began with Dr. Firth. He read the key findings aloud. No evidence of cognitive decline, impairment, or diminished capacity. He noted that the evaluation lasted 2 hours and 15 minutes, that Dr. Firth had 28 years of experience, and that the petitioner's claims of mental decline were supported by no medical evidence whatsoever. Judge Leong made a note. Gerald Voss did not object. Second, Vinny presented the Harbor Families Coalition filing. 21 sworn statements. He chose 3 to read aloud. Sal Medeiros described 42 years of daily interaction with me and concluded, "Frank Moretti has never once forgotten a name, a mooring line, or a promise." Rosa Benedetti detailed 7 occasions when I extended her grace periods on slip fees without being asked. Pete Kowalski's statement was the shortest. It said, "Frank Moretti is the best man I have ever known, and anyone who says otherwise has never pulled a net beside him." Voss objected, calling them character testimony rather than expert opinion. Judge Leong overruled him. Third, Elena took the stand. She walked the court through the fictional vendor accounts. North Shore Marine Coatings, Essex Dock Repair Incorporated, Cape Ann Fuel Services, LLC. She showed the sequential invoice numbering, the monthly billing patterns, the bank records tracing payments to 3 accounts controlled by Vale and Prescott Ventures LLC, managed by Kristen A. Vale and Ryan M. Prescott. Total embezzled, $81,400. Voss cross-examined her for 12 minutes. He challenged the chain of custody. Elena produced notarized copies. He suggested the vendors might be legitimate businesses that failed to register. Elena said, "Counsel, a legitimate business does not use sequential invoice numbers across 3 supposedly independent companies, does not lack a tax identification number, and does not deposit its payments into an account controlled by the respondent's daughter-in-law." Voss sat down. Fourth, Vinny read Gwen Hadley's sworn affidavit. Gwen had cooperated in exchange for a leniency recommendation from the United States Attorney's Office. The affidavit described Kristen providing company names, bank account numbers, and invoice templates. It confirmed that Gwen never spoke directly to Tony about any of it. Fifth, Janet Draper Rooney took the stand. She described her brother Colin's marriage to Kristen, the rapid courtship, the financial manipulation, the Delaware LLC called Vale Property Solutions, the $38,000 that vanished. She said, "What happened to my brother is exactly what is happening to Mr. Moretti. The same woman, the same method, the same lies." Voss objected on relevance. Judge Leong overruled him, citing pattern of behavior relevant to petitioner credibility. Sixth, Vinny presented Gwen's identification of Ryan Prescott at Kristen's apartment with the Gloucester Harbor redevelopment slide deck on his laptop. He entered Meridian Coastal Group's corporate profile into evidence. 14 waterfront conversions. The $40 million Kennebunkport Marina. He asked the court to consider whether a conservatorship petition filed by a woman whose business partner runs a waterfront development company, might serve interests beyond the welfare of a 70-year-old fisherman. 7th, Vinny introduced Dr. Price's audio analysis. He played the 11-second recording again. Then Price's annotated version highlighting the spectral splice between boy and have, the noise floor shifts, and the missing preparatory breath. He read her conclusion. This recording is a composite assembled from at least 3 separate audio sources. It does not represent a continuous utterance. The submitted audio is fabricated. The courtroom was silent for 4 seconds after Vinny finished. Judge Leong removed her glasses and looked directly at Kristen. She said, "Counsel, does your client wish to respond to the evidence regarding the audio recording?" Voss stood and said his client maintained the recording was authentic and provided by a concerned family friend. Judge Leong said the court would weigh Dr. Price's expert analysis accordingly. I looked at Tony. He was staring at the floor, hands clasped between his knees, shoulders curved inward, like a man bracing for something heavy. He had not looked at Kristen once in 2 hours. When she first sat down, there was 1 empty seat between them. Now there were 2. He had moved without anyone noticing. Vinny turned to the judge and delivered his closing. Your Honor, the respondent asks this court to deny the conservatorship petition in its entirety. The evidence demonstrates not a man in decline, but a man under siege. A siege orchestrated by the petitioner to gain control over assets she intends to transfer to a commercial development enterprise. Frank Moretti is not confused. He is not impaired. He is a 70-year-old man who has run a working harbor for 42 years, trusted by 23 families, whose late wife loved him enough to protect him from beyond the grave. I asked the court to see what Donna Moretti saw. A good man worth defending. Judge Leong said she would issue her ruling within 72 hours. She struck her gavel once. The sound cracked through the courtroom like a branch snapping in winter. Kristen walked out first without speaking to Voss or Tony. Voss followed with his briefcase, and an expression I recognized from years of watching men realize they had bet on the wrong tide. Tony did not stand. He sat on that bench long after the courtroom emptied. I stood near the door and waited. Some distances cannot be crossed by walking. They can only be crossed by waiting. All of the BCs, some distances cannot be crossed by waiting. He finally rose, looked at me across the empty rows, and said 2 words. The letter. I nodded. He said, "She knew." I said, "She always knew." He walked past me and out the door without stopping. But as he passed, I felt his hand brush my arm. Brief, light, like a rope thrown across dark water, not yet tied but no longer drifting. The ruling came on a Monday morning, 57 days after the wedding, 3 days before the conservatorship deadline would have expired on its own. Vinny called me at 8:14. He said 2 words. We won. Then he said, "Come to my office. There is more." I drove to Main Street with the windows down. The October air carried the smell of turning leaves and harbor brine. The 2 scents that have defined every autumn of my life. I parked behind Vinny's building and climbed the stairs to his office on the 2nd floor. Elena was already there, sitting in the leather chair by the window with her laptop open. Ruth Chen sat in the corner, straight-backed, reading glasses on, holding a document I could see was several pages long. Vinny stood behind his desk with the phone pressed to his ear, speaking quietly to someone I could not identify. He hung up and handed me the ruling. Judge Leong's decision was 11 pages. I am not a man who reads legal documents for pleasure, but I read every word of those 11 pages, and I will carry certain sentences with me until the day they lower me into the ground next to Donna. The conservatorship petition was denied. Judge Leong wrote that the petitioner had failed to present any credible medical evidence of diminished capacity and that Dr. Firth's evaluation, combined with the sworn statements of 21 community members, established overwhelmingly that the respondent is a competent, lucid, and engaged individual. She noted that the audio recording submitted by the petitioner had been conclusively determined to be fabricated by a qualified forensic expert and stated that the submission of manufactured evidence to this court is a matter of grave concern that will be referred for further investigation. She wrote 2 paragraphs about Elena's financial findings. She described the fictional vendor scheme as a calculated and sustained effort to siphon funds from the respondent's business accounts and noted that the connection between the receiving accounts and a limited liability company managed by the petitioner raises serious questions about the Gaetian petitioner's motives in seeking conservatorship. She recommended that the matter be referred to the Essex County District Attorney and the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts for potential criminal investigation. She wrote 1 paragraph about Janet Draper Rooney's testimony. She called it a credible and troubling account of a substantially similar pattern of financial manipulation by the petitioner in a prior marriage, and stated that this pattern further undermines the petitioner's standing to seek conservatorship over anyone. The final paragraph was the one that broke me. Judge Leong wrote, "The court notes that the respondent's late wife, Donna Moretti, took extraordinary measures to protect her husband and the family's assets in anticipation of precisely the kind of predatory action this petition represents. The living trust she established, the documentation she compiled, and the network of protection she arranged demonstrate a level of foresight and devotion that this court finds deeply compelling. Donna Moretti is not a party to these proceedings, but her presence is felt in every exhibit and every safeguard that has been presented. The court honors her preparation and finds that the trust she created is valid, enforceable, and shall remain in full effect." I set the ruling down on Vinny's desk and pressed my palms flat against the wood. I needed something solid under my hands. Vinny gave me a moment. Then he said, "Frank, there is more. The United States Attorney's Office has been in contact with Elena for the past 2 weeks. Based on her financial evidence, Gwen Hadley's cooperation, and the court's referral, they are opening a formal federal investigation into Kristen Vale, Ryan Prescott, and Meridian Coastal Group. The charges under consideration include wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse, and submission of fabricated evidence to a state court." Elena said, "Prescott's firm has been under scrutiny before. 2 of their 14 waterfront projects involved complaints from original property owners who alleged coercion or financial manipulation during the acquisition process. Neither complaint resulted in charges, but the pattern is there. With Gwen's testimony and the Draper precedent, the federal prosecutors believe they have enough to convene a grand jury." Ruth spoke for the first time that morning. She said, "Frank, there is one more thing. Kristen's attorney filed a motion to withdraw representation yesterday afternoon. Gerald Voss is no longer representing her." I asked what that meant. Ruth said, "It means her own lawyer does not want to be associated with what comes next." Vinny's phone rang again. He answered, listened for about 90 seconds, then hung up, and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 35 years of friendship. He said, "That was Tony. He wants to come to the harbor. He wants to talk." I said, "When?" Vinny said, "Now." I drove to the harbor alone. The morning light was sharp and clean, the kind of light that makes the water look like hammered silver. I parked in my usual spot near the bait shop and walked out onto the dock. The boats rocked gently in their slips. Bobby Tran was backing his trawler out of slip 12, his daughter Lynn waving from the stern. The Herrera brothers were loading gear onto their gill netter. Rosa Benedetti was hosing down the deck of her lobster boat, the red hull bright against the gray water. Sal Medeiros stood at slip 7, coiling a line with the unconscious precision of a man who has done the same thing 10,000 times. I walked to the end of the dock and stood beside the Santa Lucia. Her deck was still weathered, her paint still faded, her hull still carrying the scars of a 31-day Atlantic crossing in 1948. But she looked different to me now. She looked lighter. The secrets she had held for 5 years were out in the world doing the work Donna intended them to do. Tony's car pulled into the lot at 11:22. He got out and stood there for a moment, looking at the harbor, the way a man looks at a place he abandoned and is seeing clearly for the first time since he left. He walked onto the dock slowly, not the deliberate heel-first walk of his mother. Something new, something uncertain but moving forward. He reached me at the end of the dock and stood beside me, both of us facing the water. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "I read Mom's letter 3 times. I said, "What did she say?" He shook his head. He said, "I cannot tell you yet. But she asked me to do something, and I am going to do it." I did not ask what it was. Donna had written that letter for Tony, not for me. Whatever she asked of him was between mother and son, delivered across the divide that death creates but love sometimes bridges. We stood there together, father and son, watching the fishing boats move through the channel toward open water. The harbor was alive with the sounds of engines and gulls and ropes pulled taut against cleats. Somewhere behind us, in a courthouse in Salem, a judge's ruling was being filed into the permanent record. Somewhere in Boston, federal prosecutors were opening folders with Kristen Vale's name on them. And somewhere on this dock, in the space between Tony's shoulder and mine, a rope that had been drifting in dark water was beginning to find something to hold on to. Tony came to the harbor every morning for the next 2 weeks. He arrived before 6, parked beside my truck, and walked the dock with me the way I had walked it alone for 42 years. He did not say much at first. He watched. He listened. He learned the rhythm of a working harbor, the sounds that meant normal, and the silences that meant something needed attention. He learned that Bobby Tran's engine idled high on cold mornings, and that the Herrera brothers always argued about bait before every trip, and that Rosa Benedetti sang Portuguese hymns while she cleaned her traps. On the 4th morning, he asked me to teach him how to check the mooring lines. I showed him the way my father showed me. You do not just look at the line. You feel it. You run your hand along the rope and let the fibers tell you where the wear is. A line that is fraying near the cleat has too much tension. A line that is soft in the middle has too much slack. A good mooring line should feel alive in your hand, taut but flexible, like a conversation between the boat and the water. Tony listened with his whole body. He crouched beside the cleat at slip 7, Sal's slip, and ran his palm along the rope 3 times before he nodded. Sal watched from his wheelhouse and said nothing. But later that afternoon, he stopped by the office and said, "Frank, your boy has good hands. He just needs to learn what they are for." I almost told Sal what Donna used to say about Tony, that he would run this harbor one day. But I kept it to myself. Some prophecies work better when you let them arrive on their own. On the 11th day, Tony told me what Donna's letter said. We were sitting on the processing house steps, eating sandwiches from the deli on Main Street. The same sandwiches Elena used to buy during her audit. Tony set his sandwich down and stared at the water for a long time. Then he said, "Mom wrote that she was not angry at me for leaving. She said a harbor is not a cage and a sun is not an anchor. She said she was proud of the life I built in Hartford, even though it was far from the water. But she asked me to remember that this dock was not just wood and concrete. It was the place where 23 families fed their children, and it needed someone to protect it after she and I were both gone." He paused. His voice was steady, but his jaw was doing that hard-line thing again, the one he borrowed from me. He said, "She told me she suspected Kristen. She did not use those words. She wrote, 'I have concerns about the woman you love, and I know you will not hear them from me while I am alive, so I am writing them down for the day you are ready.'" She listed 5 observations, 5 things she noticed about Kristen in the first 3 months. The way she asked about property before she asked about people. The way she redirected conversations about money. The way she never mentioned her life before Tony. The way she studied the harbor records when she thought no one was watching. The way she smiled when she said the word transition. Tony looked at me. He said, "Mom asked me to do 2 things. First, come back to the harbor and learn what it means to run it. Not because I owe it to her or to you, but because the 23 families deserve someone who understands what this dock carries. Second, she asked me to forgive you for whatever you had to do to protect it. She wrote, "Your father will make choices that hurt you. He will keep secrets and withhold truth, and it will feel like betrayal. But everything he does because I asked him to. Do not punish him for keeping his promises to a dead woman." I set my sandwich down. The harbor sounds continued around us. Engines, gulls, water, rope. I said, "She wrote that." Tony nodded. He said, word for word. I memorized it. We sat on those steps for a while without talking. There was nothing to say that the silence did not say better. My wife had written a letter to our son from her deathbed. A letter that traveled through time inside a boat built in Sicily, carried across an ocean, and opened on a morning in Salem 60 days after a wedding, where everything fell apart. She had known. She had known about Kristen, about Tony's blindness, about my stubbornness, about the choices that would wound us both, and she had written the words that would bring us back together after the damage was done. 3 weeks after the ruling, Vinny called with news from the federal investigation. Ryan Prescott had been indicted by a grand jury on 4 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of mail fraud, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse. Meridian Coastal Group's assets were frozen pending investigation. 2 of their former property acquisitions in Maine and Connecticut were being re-examined for similar patterns of financial manipulation. Kristen had not been indicted. The United States Attorney's Office offered her a cooperation agreement. She would provide testimony against Prescott, turn over all communications related to the harbor scheme, and submit to a full forensic review of her personal finances. In exchange, she would avoid federal charges. She accepted. As part of the agreement, she formally withdrew the conservatorship petition, the marital property claim she had filed through Voss, and a harassment complaint she had submitted against me 3 weeks after the wedding that I had not even known about until Vinny told me. Vinny said, "It is over, Frank. The legal part, anyway." I said, "What about Kristen and Tony?" Vinny paused. He said, "That is not a legal question, Frank. That is a family one, and those are harder." Tony filed for divorce on a Tuesday in November. He did not tell me beforehand. I found out when he walked into the harbor office and set the filing on my desk without ceremony. He said, "I need to ask you something. Can I stay in the apartment above the bait shop until I find a place?" The apartment was small, cold in winter, and smelled permanently of herring. Donna had used it as overflow storage for her filing cabinets. I said, "It is yours for as long as you need it." He picked up the filing, walked to the door, and stopped. He said, "Dad, I am sorry." I said, "You do not owe me an apology, Tony. You owe yourself one." He almost smiled. Then he left, and I heard his footsteps on the dock. Heel first, deliberate. His mother's walk returning 1 step at a time. Frank Moretti did not build a monument to his victory. He did not hold a press conference or write an editorial or post a single word about the case online. The morning after Tony moved into the apartment above the bait shop, Frank walked to the end of the dock at 5:15, the same time he had walked there every morning for 42 years, and checked the mooring lines. He ran his hand along each rope the way his father taught him, the way he had just taught Tony. Then he made coffee in the processing house office, sat at Donna's old desk, and opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, he wrote 3 words: The Donna Moretti Foundation. The idea had been forming since the night he stood on Ruth Chen's porch and smelled hydrangeas in the rain. Donna had spent her final months protecting assets. But Donna had never been a woman who believed in holding things. She believed in moving them forward, the way a harbor moves boats from shore to sea and back again. The trust she built was a wall. The foundation Frank created from it was a door. He called Vinny the next morning. Then he called Ruth. Then he called Elena Navarro in Providence and asked if she would be willing to serve as the foundation's financial advisor on a volunteer basis. Elena said yes before he finished the question. He called Sal Medeiros and asked if the Harbor Families Coalition would serve as a community advisory board. Sal said he would ask the families. By the end of the week, all 23 had agreed. Frank seeded the foundation with personal savings and a portion of the harbor's annual revenue. But the first major contribution came from a man named Dwight Calloway, a retired lobsterman from Rockport who had fished alongside Frank's father for 20 years. Dwight had sold his fleet in 2010 and invested wisely. He read about the case in a local newspaper article written by Diane Calloway, the same Boston Globe journalist who had published Kristen's sympathetic interview months earlier. Calloway had returned to the story after the court ruling and written a follow-up piece titled The Harbor That Held. Dwight read it on a Sunday morning, drove to Gloucester that afternoon, sat across from Frank in the processing house office, and wrote a check for $500,000. He said, "Your wife saved this harbor, Frank. This money is for whatever she would have done next." The Donna Moretti Foundation launched in the spring with a single mission: provide agricultural and maritime education to low-income youth and veterans in the Gloucester and North Shore communities. Frank chose that focus because of two people. The first was Danny Kowalski, the young veteran who told Frank at the Portuguese-American Social Club that the harbor had saved his life after 2 tours overseas. The second was Lynn Tran, Bobby's daughter, who volunteered her legal expertise to help structure the foundation's non-profit filing, and told Frank that every kid growing up in a fishing family deserves to know there is a future in the water, not just a past. In its first 2 years, the foundation enrolled 47 young participants in maritime apprenticeship programs. 12 military veterans completed full apprenticeships, and 3 were hired permanently by harbor families. The foundation distributed $280,000 in community grants to local fishing cooperatives, boat repair workshops, and marine conservation projects. It partnered with Oregon State University's Marine Sciences program to create a summer research fellowship for first-generation college students from working waterfront communities. Danny Kowalski became the foundation's first full-time employee, serving as veteran outreach coordinator. Lynn Tran served on the board of directors, and there was one more name on the foundation's roster that no one expected. 6 months after the federal case concluded, Kristen Vale contacted Vinnie Caruso. She asked if there was any way she could contribute to the foundation. Not financially. She understood she had no right to offer money, but she wanted to work. Vinnie brought the request to Frank, who sat with it for 3 days before responding. He told Vinnie to offer Kristen a 6-month volunteer position with strict terms: no access to financial records, no authority over programs, no public representation of the foundation. She would work under Danny Kowalski's supervision, doing whatever needed doing: filing, cleaning, sorting donations. The work nobody sees and nobody thanks you for. Kristen accepted. Frank did not speak to her directly. He did not need to. The term said everything. This is not forgiveness. This is a door. What you do with it is yours to carry. Tony worked the harbor through that winter and into the following spring. He learned to read the weather by watching the water. He learned to predict engine trouble by listening to the idle. He learned every family's name, every slip's history, every boat's temperament. Sal Medeiros told Frank one evening, "Your boy does not just have good hands anymore. He has good eyes." Frank nodded and said nothing. But that night he went home and opened Donna's notebook, the one from the Santa Lucia, and on the last blank page he wrote, "She was right. He is going to run this harbor." On the 2nd anniversary of the foundation's launch, Frank held a gathering on the dock. Not a celebration. Donna would not have wanted a celebration. A gathering. The 23 families came. Danny Kowalski spoke about what the harbor meant to veterans who needed purpose. Lynn Tran spoke about the future of working waterfronts. Tony spoke last. He stood on the same dock where Kristen had demanded the harbor keys 2 years earlier and said, "My mother left me a letter. In it she wrote that a harbor is not a cage, and a sun is not an anchor. She was right about that. But she also wrote that some things are worth coming home for. She was right about that too. Frank stood at the back of the crowd and listened to his son's voice carry across the water. The Santa Lucia rocked gently in slip 23. Her deck had been sanded and sealed. Her paint had been refreshed. Tony had done the work himself over 3 weekends, kneeling on the same planks where Giuseppe once stood steering through an Atlantic storm, where Frank once knelt with a $340 ring, where Donna once hid the evidence that would save everything. The harbor lights came on as the sun went down. The water turned from silver to black. The boats settled into their slips for the night, rocking in that slow, patient rhythm that has not changed since Giuseppe first tied a line to this dock in 1951. Frank looked at the ocean and thought about what Donna told him once on a Sunday morning while reading Mary Oliver. She said, "Frankie, the only revenge worth having is building something that outlasts the people who tried to tear you down." He smiled. Not because it was over, but because it was continuing. If this story moved you, take a moment to think about the people in your life who are quietly building walls around the things you love. The ones who check the numbers, the ones who write the letters, the ones who prepare for storms you cannot yet see. Sometimes the greatest act of love is not the one you witness. It is the one you discover long after the person who made it is gone. If you have someone like that, call them. If you lost someone like that, carry what they built. And if you are someone like that, keep building. The harbor needs you. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new one. Leave a comment telling us what Donna's story meant to you, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.